When at last he reached his hotel, he stopped short on the threshold and asked himself, "How am I going to tell her?" He realized that during his 2 hours' perambulations since he had left the doctor's office, he had thought out nothing, planned nothing, not even let his imagination glance at the future, but simply allowed himself to be absorbed into the softly palpitating life about him, like a tired traveler sinking at his journey's end into a warm bath. Only now, at the foot of the stairs, did he see the future facing him, and understand that he knew no more how to prepare for the return to life than he had for the leaving it, if only she takes it quietly, without too much fuss. He thought, shrinking in advance from any disturbance of those still waters into which it was too beatific to subside. That New York diagnosis was a mistake, an utter mistake. He began vehemently, and then paused, arrested, silenced, by something in his wife's face which seemed to oppose an invisible resistance to what he was in the act of saying. He had hoped she would not be too emotional. And now? What was it? Did he really resent the mask of composure she had no doubt struggled to adjust during her long hours of waiting? He stood and stared at her. "I suppose you don't believe it?" He broke off, with an aimless, irritating laugh. She came to him eagerly. "But of course I do, of course." She seemed to hesitate for a second. "What I never did believe," she said abruptly, "was the other, the New York diagnosis." He continued to stare, vaguely resentful of his new attitude and of the hint of secret criticism it conveyed. He felt himself suddenly diminished in her eyes, as though she were retrospectively stripping him of some prerogative. If she had not believed in the New York diagnosis, what must her secret view of him have been all the while? "Oh, you never believed in it? And may I ask why?" He heard the edge of sarcasm in his voice. She gave a little laugh that sounded almost as aimless as his. I don't know. I suppose I couldn't bear to, simply. I couldn't believe fate could be so cruel." Still, with a tinge of sarcasm, he rejoined, "I'm glad you had your incredulity to sustain you." Inwardly he was saying, "Not a tear, not an outbreak of emotion." And his heart, dilated by the immense inrush of returning life, now contracted as if an invisible plug had been removed from it, and its fullness were slowly ebbing. "It's a queer business anyhow," he mumbled. "What is, dear?" "This being alive again. I'm not sure I know yet what it consists in." She came up and put her arms about him, almost shyly. "We will try to find out, love, together." Chapter 3. This magnificent gift of life, which the Viennese doctor had restored to him as lightly as his New York colleagues had withdrawn it, lay before Paul Dorrance like something external, outside of himself, an honor, an official rank, unexpectedly thrust on him. He did not discover till then how completely he had dissociated himself from the whole business of living. It was as if life were a growth which the surgeon's knife had already extirpated, leaving him, disembodied, on the pale verge of nonentity. All the while that he had kept saying to himself, "In a few weeks more I shall be dead." Had he not really known that he was dead already? "But what are we to do, then, dearest?" he heard his wife asking. "What do you want? Would you like to go home at once? Do you want me to cable to have the flat got ready?" He looked at her in astonishment, wounded by such unperceivingness. "Go home? To New York? To his old life there? Did she really think of it as something possible, even simple and natural? Why, the small space she had occupied there had closed up already. He felt himself as completely excluded from that other life, as if his absence had lasted for years. And what did she mean by going home? The old Paul Dorrance, who had made his will, wound up his affairs, resigned from his clubs and directorships, pensioned off his old servants, and married his old mistress. That Dorrance was as dead as if he had taken that final step for which all those others were but the hasty preparation. He was dead. This new Dorrance, with his new health, his new leisure, and his new wife, was an intruder for whom a whole new existence would have to be planned out. And how could anything be decided until one got to know the new Paul Dorrance a little better? Conscious that his wife was waiting for his answer, he said, "Oh, this fellow here may be all wrong. Anyhow, he wants me to take a cure somewhere first. I've got the name written down. After all, we will see. But wouldn't you rather travel for a year or so? How about South Africa or India next winter?" He ventured at random, after trying to think of some point of the globe even more remote from New York. Chapter 4. The cure was successful. The Viennese specialist's diagnosis proved to be correct, and the Paul Dorrances celebrated the event by 2 years of foreign travel. But Dorrance never felt again the unconditioned ecstasy he had tasted as he walked out from the doctor's door into the lamplit summer streets. After that, at the very moment of re-entering his hotel, the effort of readjustment had begun, and ever since it had gone on. For a few months, the wanderers, weary of change, had settled in Florence, captivated by an arcaded villa on a cypress-walled hill, and the new Paul Dorrance, whom it was now the other's incessant task to study and placate, had toyed with the idea of a middle life of cultivated leisure. But he soon grew tired of his opportunities, and found it necessary to move on, and forget in strenuous travel his incapacity for assimilation and reflection. And before the 2 years were over, the old Paul Dorrance, who had constituted himself the other's Korean prime minister, discovered that the old and the new were one, and that the original Paul Dorrance was there, unchanged, unchangeable, and impatient to get back to his old niche, because it was too late to adapt himself to any other. So the flat was reopened, and the Dorrances returned to New York. The completeness of his identity with the old Paul Dorrance was indelibly impressed on the new one on the first evening of his return home. There he was, the same man in the same setting as when, 2 years earlier, he had glanced down from the same armchair and seen the diagnosis of the consulting physicians at his feet. The hour was late, the room profoundly still. No touch of outward reality intervened between him and that hallucinating vision. He almost saw the paper on the floor, and with the same gesture as before, he covered his eyes to shut it out. 2 years ago, and nothing was changed. After so many changes, except that he should not hear the hesitating ring at the door, should not again see Eleanor Wellwood, pale and questioning, on the threshold. Eleanor Wellwood did not ring his doorbell now. She had her own latchkey. She was no longer Eleanor Wellwood, but Eleanor Dorrance, and asleep at this moment in the bedroom which had been Dorrance's, and was now encumbered with feminine properties, while his own were uncomfortably wedged into the cramped guest room of the flat. Yes, that was the only change in his life, and how aptly the change in the room symbolized it. During their travels, Even after Dorance's return to health, his wife's presence had been like a soft accompaniment of music, a painted background to the idle episodes of convalescence. Now that he was about to fit himself into the familiar furrow of old habits and relations, he felt as if she were already expanding and crowding him into a corner. He did not mind about the room, so he assured himself, though with a twinge of regret for the slant of winter sun, which never reached the guest room. What he minded was what he now recognized as the huge practical joke that fate had played on him. He had never meant, he, the healthy, vigorous, middle-aged Paul Dorrance, to marry this faded woman, for whom he had so long ceased to feel anything but a friendly tenderness. It was the bogey of death, starting out from the warm folds of his closely curtained life, and then left him to expiate his folly. Poor Eleanor! It was not her fault if he had imagined, in a moment of morbid retrospection, that happiness would transform and enlarge her. Under the surface changes she was still the same, a perfect companion while he was ill and lonely, an unwitting encumbrance now that, unchanged also, he was restored to the life from which his instinct of self-preservation had so long excluded her. Why had he not trusted to that instinct, which had warned him she was the woman for a sentimental parenthesis, not for the pitiless continuity of marriage? Why, even her face declared it. A lovely profile, yes, but somehow the full face was inadequate. Dorrance suddenly remembered another face, that of a girl they had met in Cairo the previous winter. He felt the shock of her young fairness, saw the fruity bloom of her cheeks, the light animal vigor of every movement. He heard her rich beckoning laugh, and met the eyes questioning his under the queer slant of her lids. Someone had said, "She has had an offer from a man who can give her everything a woman wants. But she has refused, and no one can make out why." Dorrance knew. She had written to him since, and he had not answered her letters. And now here he was, installed once more in the old routine he could not live without, yet from which all the old savour was gone. "I wonder why I was so scared of dying," he thought. Then the truth flashed on him. "Why, you fool? You have been dead all the time." That first diagnosis was the true one. Only they put it on the physical plane by mistake. The next day he began to insert himself painfully into his furrow. Chapter 5. One evening, some 2 years later, as Paul Dorrance put his latchkey into his door, he said to himself reluctantly, "Perhaps I really ought to take her away for a change." There was nothing nowadays that he dreaded as much as change. He had had his fill of the unexpected, and it had not agreed with him. Now that he had fitted himself once more into his furrow, all he asked was to stay there. It had even become an effort, when summer came, to put off his New York habits and go with his wife to their little place in the country. And the idea that he might have to go away with her in mid-February was positively disturbing. For the past 10 days she had been fighting a bad bronchitis, following on influenza. But fighting was hardly the right word. She, usually so elastic, so indomitable, had not shown her usual resiliency. And Dorrance, from the vantage ground of his recovered health, wondered a little at her lack of spirit. "She mustn't let herself go," he warned her gently. "I was in a good deal tighter place myself not so many years ago. And look at me now.